And welcome to the Engage program at the Bush Center presented by Highland Capital Management. And thank you all for being here for what promises to be a thought-provoking and probably an entertaining discussion on today's geopolitical flashpoints. We're thrilled that with us tonight are two of the foremost experts on geopolitics, Ian Bremmer and Niall Ferguson, and I want to thank Dana Perino for returning to the Bush Center to be tonight's moderator. First, we have some exciting news to share tonight about our fall series. We have scheduled on September 18th a conversation with U.S. Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch to be here on that day as part of our Engage series. And then on November 4th, we will have the Laura Bush Book Club event with Mrs. Bush and author Alexander McCall Smith. So those notices and emails will be going out in the next week or so. It will sell out rather quickly, so please watch your emails for that, and members get a first dib, so if you're here as a guest and not a member, you might want to consider. The books for tonight, from tonight's all three participants, we have signed copies of books that will be on sale after the program. This Engage series is made possible by the support of Highland Capital Management, which so generously has endowed this program. We're grateful for their support and their friendship, and it goes back all the way to the founding of the Bush Center. Their commitment to the engagement agenda allows us to bring programs that you can't see anywhere else, and tonight is no exception. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Co-Chief Investment Officer and Head of Trading of Highland Capital Management, Joe Sowen, who will introduce tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. We're excited to welcome you all to the second annual Highland Capital Lecture, part of our Engage series here at the Bush Center. We are proud to serve as a presenting sponsor of the series. When we launched this partnership several years ago, we came up with the idea of the Highland Capital Lecture as a way to devote one program each year to topics that impact the global economy. It's safe to say that our topic tonight, geopolitical flashpoints, satisfies that requirement. One of the many reasons we're so fortunate to have the Bush Center here in Dallas is that it attracts speakers from all over the world to our city, which we love, in a way that few other institutions can. That convening power is on display in our lineup tonight. And not only do we have three incredible speakers, but the topic, geopolitical flashpoints, gives us more to cover by the minute. So hopefully in the next hour, we can make a dent. We're pleased to have with us tonight Niall Ferguson, who is one of the world's most renowned historians and is the author of A Scent of Money and The Square and the Tower, and many other New York Times bestsellers. Niall is also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford and at the Center of European Studies at Harvard. Ian Bremmer is our other panelist this evening. Ian is the president and founder of Eurasia Group and is one of the leading experts on global political risk. His most recent New York Times bestseller is Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism. Our moderator is Dana Perino. Dana is the former White House press secretary under President Bush. She's also the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, and she's the host of The Daily Briefing and the co-host of The Five on Fox News. Many thanks for our speakers for being here tonight, and thank you to everyone in the audience for your support of the Bush Center and an important work they do both locally here in Dallas and across the world. So please join me in welcoming Niall, Ian, and Dana to the Bush Center stage.
Thank you, Joe. We appreciate that. And of course, Highland, thank you so much, because this is definitely the place to be if you are in Dallas. Thanks so much for coming out. It was a really great introduction. One thing that he didn't mention is that Niall has a distinct advantage tonight because he has a Scottish accent. So, of course, he's automatically going to sound smarter and more informed. I do want to take a moment for all of us to...
It depends what Scottish accent.
Use your best Glasgow. I do want to take just a moment to mark a day and have an observance. This would have been George H.W. Bush's 95th birthday. Yeah, we can give him a round of applause. And of course, obviously, this is the first year that we celebrate his birthday, but he is not with us. And it was such a tremendous outpouring of love from around the world for him and Barbara Bush in 2018. And what a way to have a send-off, right, with the world thanking you for your leadership and contributions to the world. So, you probably saw it, but if you didn't, I'll mention the United States Postal Service revealed today a new postage stamp with a gorgeous photo of George H.W. Bush. So you'll make sure to get some of those. Forever, George H.W. Bush. Speaking of George H.W. Bush, I do think that maybe that we just start with China. Of course, 41 was ambassador to China before he went on to do many other wonderful things in his life. And there are no shortage of topics. We could spend the entire 50 minutes on China. We won't. We're going to try to hit the global hotspots. These are two of the most, despite what I said before, they're both extremely well informed. And they write amazingly. They argue so well. And they've actually been in the rooms with these world leaders, even just recently. So if we could start with China, and I think maybe just if you could both give a broad view of how you think things are going, and then we can talk about trade and technology or even the events in Hong Kong and what's going on, but a broader view of where we are with China today. I'll start with you, Neil.
Well, I mean, let's think back to George H.W. Bush's presidency. I look back on that time, and particularly the year 1989, and I remember how focused I was at that time on events in Berlin. I was living in Berlin, working on my doctoral dissertation. An extraordinary revolution was unfolding, fraught with risk. Through the summer of 1989, we kept wondering, would there be a crackdown in one of the East European cities? Would Gorbachev turn out to be just another of the Soviet leaders who in the end cracked down on reform? And when that didn't happen, when the revolutions spread in that extraordinary springtime of the nations, number one, I don't think I was giving nearly enough thought to what was happening in China and to the suppression of the democracy movement in Tiananmen Square. My focus was on Europe and the excitement of that revolutionary time. So I think I was, in common with many people, underestimating the enormous importance of the fact that the Communist Party in China was not going to allow democracy to happen and did crack down in the way that we had seen happen in previous periods. And the second thing we should acknowledge is what an extraordinarily skillful part George H.W. Bush played at that time. Many things could have gone wrong. And then I was recently, last year, rereading John Meacham's excellent biography and reflecting on the extraordinary judgment calls that he made at that time, particularly on the question of German unification, which European leaders were not ready for, but he urged them to embrace. So when one steps forward into the present, it's striking how different the world is in both these respects. Now we focus on China and we realize that what has happened there has been the big historical event of our lifetime. That the rise of China turns out to be more important ultimately than the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think we also see how the role of the American presidency has changed. In 1989, the president was the skillful arbiter, diplomat, leader of alliances, broker of a peaceful transition. And today, the president is the great disruptor who's, more than any other leader in recent times, decided to stand up to China and essentially call a halt to its seemingly inexorable rise. Ian?
So, in addition to that transition of a president who was the keeper of the alliances as opposed to the great disruptor, you also had a president who was the leader of the free world. And there isn't a leader of the free world today. Just today, we've seen 1 million people demonstrating in Hong Kong in opposition to this extradition law, which would deeply undermine the independent rule and law and sovereignty in Hong Kong. And President Trump, in the gaggle in the Oval Office, said, well, I'm sure Hong Kong and Beijing will work it out. Maybe. Analytically, that is possibly the case, but it's not talking about the Hong Kong system. It's not talking about the people on the ground who are risking a lot to actually demonstrate. It's not talking about rule of law, an independent judiciary, things that historically the Americans have really stood up for. And so that's very different. I completely agree with you, Neil, that the rise of China is more important than the collapse of the Soviet Union long term. And that's because the Chinese turn out to be very different than what we presumed 20 and 30 years ago. As they get wealthier, they're not aligning with our norms and values, even as we're not sure those norms and values are ones we want to completely double down on. Instead, they're building an alternative system. And the Chinese Belt and Road, as it is not all it is being advertised for. The quality of the infrastructure is not great. The headline numbers are not the real numbers, just like Saudis, when they say they're going to buy a lot of weapons, turn out to be not quite the real numbers. But they're the only game in town for a lot of countries. And the United States is not right now offering carrots and inducements for our allies to stick with us. Instead, they're offering sticks. And for me, maybe the most interesting piece is that those sticks do actually work. I mean, we pull out of the Iranian deal by ourselves. Everyone criticizes us that was in the deal, but they are still sticking with us in squeezing the Iranians harder because our stick really works. And we're about to see that, I think, with China on Huawei. There are a lot of countries out there that want to buy a cheaper system from the Chinese, including a lot of Europeans. But if the Americans decide we're going to continue with this Department of Commerce ruling, and if we don't head towards a deal in the next few weeks in Japan with the Chinese, and right now it does not look that way, in my view, then we're going to destroy Huawei, and these countries are going to be aligned with us. I think that we are, literally right now, I think we're kind of seeing the turning point on the US-China relationship. The Pence speech that you've been involved in, that's coming up in the next few weeks, the national security document that talks about China's strategic competitor, and China's response, Xi Jinping's response to all that, is a fundamentally different ordering of the way we think about the global system. And, you know, interesting for us, we get to watch it play out.
Neil, if you don't already follow them or read their work, I encourage you to. And I my assistant had a little assignment. She had to put together the last 3 months of columns by the two of them, and I spent the plane ride reading them.
You said you were asleep on the plane.
I slept 2 hours. It's a 3-hour flight. 3 hours and 9
written
minutes.
very much,
saying.
apparently. Yeah, exactly.
But now you'll know that I actually read it, because you wrote about a second Cold War. Do you think we are in one with China? Are we well equipped to win one, if we are actually in it? And is this the pivot point, the next 4 weeks, and this meeting that's coming up between President Trump and the G20 leaders in Asia? Will we know at that point where we're headed?
Well, Cold War I ended in 1989, and Cold War II is beginning in 2019. It is much more now than just a trade war, as Ian's rightly said. It's a tech war, but I think it's beyond just a tech war. I think we are, in many ways, repeating the pattern that began the first Cold War. It escalates quickly. It spreads into a bunch of different geographies that you didn't realize were in play, from Hong Kong to Venezuela. I think the striking feature of this process is how quickly sentiment has changed in this country. When President Trump began threatening to impose tariffs on China in his election campaign in 2015-16, he was regarded as a complete maverick. The consensus in Washington, and indeed extending across the country to Silicon Valley, was that Chimerica was here to stay. And I'd used that word Chimerica back in 2007 to show just how intertwined the Chinese and American economies had begun. So Trump seemed a complete outlier when he began going after China. With an amazing rapidity, the United States, both at the elite level and at the popular level, seems to me to have got on board with an anti-China strategy. It's a consensus that is bipartisan, and how many other things are bipartisan in Washington today? I can only really think of one, which is regulating big tech. Anti-China has become consensus. The policy intellectuals, whether they're in national security or in economic policy, seem to me to be on board. So you have to give President Trump some credit. He has achieved a remarkable shift in our attitudes. It's been expressed most articulately in the national security strategy document that came out in December 2017, H.R. McMaster's achievement, now my colleague at the Hoover Institution, and also in Vice President Pence's speech in October at the Hudson Institute, which set out very clearly that this is about much more than trade now. It is about resisting a Chinese strategic ambition to drive the United States out of what we're now calling the Indo-Pacific region. So I do feel, as an historian, as if I've seen some of this movie before, that the Pence speech could very well be cited by future historians as one of the key milestones in the origins of Cold War II. And Dana, you asked, is this a war we want to be in and a war that we can win? I don't think it can be the same as Cold War I. I think we need to recognize that if we are embarking on the containment of China, that it'll be very different from the containment of the Soviet Union, not least because we still are pretty intertwined with China economically. Think of the differences. You know, there weren't, in the late 1940s, 400,000 Soviet students at American colleges. There weren't a whole bunch of American tech companies heavily reliant on exports to the Soviet Union. The two countries were essentially completely separate from one another, with tiny numbers of citizens on the other side, and most of them were recognizably spies. So I don't think this can be the same as, whereas now it's a little harder to tell. I don't think it can be the same as Cold War I, and this is a crucial point, China is, economically at least, a much more formidable opponent. Despite many predictions to the contrary, the Soviet Union never got close economically to the United States. If it got to 40% of US GDP, that's a pretty much the best it ever got to. And economically, it was clearly failing by the 1970s and was in complete near collapse in the 1980s. So this is different, and China's growth is slowing, but it is still growing at around 6% per annum, and that is a formidable challenge.
And I think, Ian, you've written or spoken recently about just the leverage. So using economics as a weapon, rather than any intervention or military intervention when it comes to wanting to get your way. So President Trump's utilizing that in different places. With Mexico, that might work because your leverage is stronger, but with China, is that going to work?
With Mexico, it works because the Mexicans get everything from us. The remittances, the trade, the tourism, the drug export, right? They're completely reliant on us. And I mean, President Lopez Obrador, with 80% approval ratings almost right now, still recognized that he could not play the nationalist card. He had to say yes to whatever it was that Trump wanted, sign that piece of paper. We don't know what's on. Iran, again, we have a lot of influence over the Iranians because ultimately if we cut companies off and say they can't use our banking system, we've got the influence. North Korea, we don't have that influence. So Trump can meet with Kim Jong-un, but ultimately the Chinese and the South Koreans matter a lot more than the Americans do. So you can't push the same strategy. China's an interesting one because we do have a lot of leverage, but they have some leverage too. And I mean, Neil just talked about how the Americans have changed on China, and Trump in some ways took the lead there, but now it's bipartisan. Let's look at the other side. The Chinese have changed too. Xi Jinping, very different kind of leader, much stronger, consolidated leadership, stronger authoritarian, stronger state capitalist. First thing he does, right, is this big anti-corruption campaign. Last March, he gets rid of term limits. He can be president for life. China, as Neil and I were moving from the old Cold War to this one, the Chinese were always saying, we're small, we're poor, we can't take responsibility. Not Xi Jinping. Made in China 2025. We're going to lead the world in AI by 2030. They played right into this. And now we've got a conflict. Belt and Road, now we've got a conflict. So, I mean, I do think that it's not just that the Americans have decided that the Chinese are a problem, but the Chinese have also decided that they're kind of ready to come out and create an alternative, that the Americans may have a president that's pushing hard and punishing, but the Americans also have a president who's alienating an awful lot of other leaders around the world, and the Chinese see that as an opportunity. Maybe they overstretch. We don't know who's going to win. We do know it's a very different type of Cold War because, you know, the fact is the Chinese not only have the economic wherewithal and enough strategy to spend, but they also are today a technology superpower. 5 years ago, they weren't. Joe Biden is the one person who has decided to say China's not a competitor.
Oh, no,
right?
now he changed his
I
mind.
know he changed his mind. I saw it, but he said it.
But if you wait half an hour, we might have another change.
And Trump does that too. You know, it was interesting. As soon as he said that, I looked back and said, when's the last trip that Biden had made to China? I think it's 2013.
Oh, it's
China literally was not a technology superpower in 2013. In 5 years, they literally became one. And I think it's that rapidity of the change. And if you play that out to what it means when China's the globally the largest economy, suddenly it becomes, this may be a Cold War that is not only very different, but maybe very imbalanced.
I agree with something you've just said, Ian. I don't want to suggest for a minute that Trump started Cold War II, because I don't think he did. That's kind of how Europeans see it. That's how a lot of American allies see it. But I think in reality, we should see the backlash against China as a reaction by the United States to an increasingly aggressive and threatening China. And I think you could argue, even before the time of Xi Jinping, the Chinese systematically were bending the rules of the World Trade Organization. They were systematically engaged in theft of intellectual property, not just from the United States. And therefore, it was long overdue that the United States said, enough already. And one of the odder things about the later Obama presidency was that, in effect, they gave up. If you look at the last national security strategy document that was Susan Rice's, it essentially admits that the United States can't stop the rise of China. The pivot to Asia had been a failure. And I think, in many ways, if you see the Obama administration's failure with respect to that particular problem, then the Trump reaction makes a lot more sense. Ordinary Americans were very responsive to Trump's call to stand up to China, not just because of the outsourcing of American manufacturing jobs, which was kind of where he started, but also because I think Americans sensed that we had allowed this to go too far, and it ultimately did pose a threat. So I think
actually
Trump
see that with farmers that are worried about not having a market, but they actually are standing really strongly behind the president, saying we understand that this has to be done. Can we transition slightly? Just that last week, I think it was, President Xi went to Russia to meet with President Putin. And what do you think about that alliance, or fake? How real is it? What about Putin's leverage or lack of leverage? What do you think?
It's not an alliance. It is a relationship of mutual convenience. The Chinese are ascendant, albeit more slowly. The Russians are in severe decline. The Chinese.
But Putin seems to think that he's really got it going on.
Oh, no, he doesn't. Oh, no, he doesn't. I mean, no. I mean, everyone says he's a great chess player. He's not. He's a great poker player with not many chips. And he knows how to psychologically take advantage of weakness and opportunities. But, I mean, you know, if you think about how much Russia has lost, I mean, Ukraine was aligned mostly with Russia. They are not anymore. The Russians ended up with taking a little piece. Central Asia is economically increasingly grabbed by the Chinese. Putin, for the first time in his presidency, had to back off of a policy that was his, not his prime minister's, not his, which was pension reform, because it was so unpopular in the demonstrations across the country. And you know, for me, the most interesting thing on Russia right now is how much they blame the United States. And yes, they intervened in our election. We know that. And yes, they supported Trump, or should I say, they really opposed Hillary. But if you think about where they are today, I thought it was really interesting that just last week, for the first time in 2.5 years, Trump state media, Putin state media, Russian state media, started going after Trump individually. They had never done that before. That's That's not coincidental.
Why do you think that is?
Because the Trump administration policy towards Russia has been extremely antagonistic on sanctions, on giving weapons to Ukraine. They just announced today 1,000 troops to Poland they're going to send over, expanding defense, Venezuela policy, Iran policy. Look, there's no question. They supported Trump in 2016 because they had a bunch of people like Manafort, Bannon, Papadopoulos, Carter Page, Flynn, that were all like completely in the bag for Russia. Those people have all been either fired or they're in jail, right? So, I mean, I will say something very controversial. I have no idea if you agree, Neil, which is I fully believe the Russians will interfere in the election in 2020.
They're already trying.
It's not clear to me they'll support Trump.
Oh. Are they for Andrew Yang?
I mean,
I'm just picking one of the 24.
I mean, if it were Trump versus Bernie, for example, I think they'd probably go for Bernie. I think if it's someone like Biden, I think it's more likely they will just try to delegitimize the elections, mess with it, promote fake news, but not actually put their thumb on the scale of Trump. I think that is
Neil, you've written
increasingly
about this disinformation campaigns from Russia, and it's not just happening in the United States, they're doing it everywhere.
Well, notice that in 2018 they tried to interfere and they were thoroughly punished because we attacked their so-called Internet Research Agency and shut it down. Didn't get much coverage, but this was a highly successful preventive act of cyber warfare against the Russians, and it successfully prevented any significant interference in the midterms. I think Ian's right to suggest that one can't predict what they will do. Their goal is, as far as possible, to delegitimize democracies wherever they can. And so they will certainly try, and they will try with new techniques to interfere in 2020. But it may well be that we are better able to thwart them than the Obama administration was in 2016 because we actually have a more aggressive cyber warfare strategy. But I want to come back to your original point about the relationship between Russia and China. Because if you think about what happened in the Cold War, one of the most important strategic moves was Henry Kissinger's opening of communications with the People's Republic in '71 and Richard Nixon's historic visit in 1972, exploiting the fundamental split that had opened up between the Russians and the Chinese in the late 1960s. Normally, China and Russia are not best pals. Historically, they have often been in conflict, and there is territory that Imperial Russia contested against Imperial China in the 19th century that is notionally still in play. So there is something very odd about the current close relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping. Odd because it doesn't feel historically normal that they should be so close. I mean, Xi and Putin meet more often than almost any two world leaders I can think of. And it is not an equal partnership for the reason that Ian gave, because Russia is in a much weaker economic position. And Russia is having to concede ground that historically it regarded as its own in Central Asia. The backyard is kind of gone. One Belt, One Road, which is really what we should call it, because that's what it's called, is a policy that initially was about expanding Chinese influence right through Russia's historic backyard. It's now become a global operation, but that was kind of the original idea. And the Russians are having to suck this up. They are playing second fiddle because they simply have no choice. They are too overcommitted in Ukraine, in the Middle East, to have any alternative but to play second fiddle to Xi Jinping. If we were thinking strategically, which I'm not sure we really are, we would be trying to work out how we can exploit such differences as must exist between the two. As long as they're closer together than they normally are historically, I think it's a problem. I think Kissinger made a very interesting observation recently. I spent a lot of time listening to Henry Kissinger because I'm writing his biography. And one of his most insightful comments was that the way things are going, Europe could end up being an appendage of a Chinese-dominated Eurasia. And the United States could become the offshore island balancing power that tries to stop that Chinese domination becoming complete. Now, this, I think, is a really important insight. It's a very big difference between now and Cold War I. Because in Cold War I, the United States was fully engaged with Europe, and Europe, Western Europe, was fully committed to the transatlantic alliance. And one of the things that's really striking to me at the moment is how weak that transatlantic alliance has started to feel.
one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the last few years is how much the Chinese have been picking off the East Europeans as a bloc. They have the 16+1 framework. They don't meet with the EU as a whole. They want to really engage East Europe because they understand the commitment to liberal democracy is lower and they need the money. And so the Chinese, you think that Putin and Xi are seeing each other a lot. Liu He and others are spending an enormous amount of time with the East Europeans. And they'll tell you that they're closer to the Chinese than they are with most Western countries. The Greeks increasingly feel that way. The Portuguese feel that way. The Italians feel that way. The Germans don't. And I think that there are real opportunities for the Americans to do strategery with...
That's your made-up word.
No. You know. I'm not sure he knows.
Saturday Night Live made it up.
Yeah.
But we thought it was real.
We thought it was real, yeah.
We had a whole meeting at the White House every week called Strategery.
So you actually made it up.
And if you got invited, you were a big deal.
See how out of the loop I am these days? I don't even know who makes up the words.
But
There's a downside to the accent.
But President Bush did come up with misunderestimated, which actually should be a word.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
But
Like
anyway,
over-exaggerate.
you were saying that
I was
the
just saying,
Chinese...
getting to strategy, the fact is that there is a strategy. The Americans are not, as Neil suggested, doing strategy to figure out how to really play and exploit these divisions. And it's because there's a lot of stick and not very much carrot. There's a carrot we could do here, and that is explicitly on the tech side. If the Europeans and others were forced to choose between the Americans and Chinese, they would proactively choose us. We don't need a stick for that, but we need to coordinate policy. It's not about TPP. It's not about trade. It's actually about standards. It's about AI. It's about data. It's about the cloud. And the Americans, we've got all the companies, but the Europeans have the regulatory expertise. They're the ones that understand privacy, understand copyright, understand like GDPR. And as Neil said before, one of the very few things that you can find bipartisan agreement on right now, it's not just China, it's on regulation on tech, except we're not good at it. Why not put those 2 points of bipartisan agreement together, right? And engage with the Europeans on it, and the Japanese and others. That would actually be a jujitsu move that would work well for the Americans strategically.
And by the way, I think the Japanese understand that very well, and indeed it's what you hear when you go to Tokyo. Can't we come up with some kind of standards on privacy online that would actually make, which the Chinese couldn't comply with?
Right.
But in Europe, one doesn't hear that discussion. What is very striking to me is the extent of anti-Americanism that has manifested itself in Europe recently. In recent polling, Germans said that they regarded the United States as a bigger threat to Germany than Russia, never mind China. I think one of the odder things about modern history is the no good deed goes unpunished phenomenon. The Germans, of all people, should be supremely grateful to the United States, because the United States not only helped to rebuild Germany after the catastrophe that culminated in 1945, but has consistently provided Germany's security with respect to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And it was the United States that persuaded Britain and France to accept the reunification of Germany under George H.W. Bush back in 1990. And what thanks does the United States get? None. The Germans probably lead the world in their antipathy to President Trump. If you look at the polls, they are the ones who are most hostile to the present administration. And when they are reminded that they are relying on for their security on the United States, because their defense spending has reached levels so low, they're almost as low as the Versailles Treaty required after World War I, their attitude is, oh no, we don't see a threat from Russia, much less from China. You, Americans, are the threat. Now, I find that baffling, and it's troubling, because if you think about it, that's the most important country in Europe. That's the kind of central state of the European Union. It is a critical partner in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they're basically not on board. So, if it's Cold War II, and the United States goes, as it did in Cold War I, to its allies and says, are you with us? I think the answers may not be yes. Certainly from the Europeans, they'll be very equivocal.
Could you then, Ian, talk about, so the Europeans just had an election, sort of like, is it like a midterm, would you say? No, it's bigger than that?
European parliamentary elections, it's different.
It's different,
Yeah.
but the establishment didn't do that well.
No.
And this is something you've seen in Europe, in America. I think you were recently in Brazil. there's just a movement afoot. There's change, there's populism, and your book, Us Versus Them, that you can get outside, is all about that.
Yep. So almost all major democracies today are experiencing this backlash, this anti-establishment sentiment, kicked off in a big way with Brexit and Neil, then here in the United States with our 2016 election, but you see it everywhere. Now, the European parliamentary elections, on the one hand, did show gains from the anti-establishment parties from most countries, yes. But, you know, if you go back in history, there's never been an expression, nationalists of the world unite, right? Because they don't know what flag they would fly. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not as concerned about European parliamentary elections. I mean, the Polish government and their populists are deeply, strongly antagonistic towards the Russians, hence the desire to have more American troops based there. The Hungarians are deeply aligned with the Russians. The Germans, the Alternatives for Deutschland, they're actually quite pro-globalization and free trade. You look at the Italians and you look at the French and you look at the Brexit party in the UK, their populists are actually much more protectionist. So they've really, I mean, even the Italians and the Austrians both have these populist parties that are actually, you know, really at each other because they have territorial disputes across the border. So you actually have, despite the fact that it's a lot messier and there are a lot more Eurosceptics that are represented, they can't agree on anything, which means that Europe, from the top down, still feels fairly stable. My concern about Europe is more, what kind of response do you get if there's a crisis? If there's an Italian debt crisis that goes forward with disagreements over their debt and their budget and the rest, I mean, you're just not going to have a strong Germany with a strong France, together with strong European institutions that say we need to make sure that we backstop all of this. And I think that the same is true globally. The resilience in the United States, if we were to have a major, let's say, Russian attack on critical infrastructure that had a big impact on our economy, kind of like what happened to Maersk and FedEx after the Russians had the cyber attack against Ukraine a couple years ago, cost billions and billions of dollars. I don't think you'd get the response like you had after 9/11 under W. I think you'd have a much more divided, much less resilient response. And what about the response from our allies? It would be weaker. What about the response from the Russians and the Chinese, who after 2008 financial crisis were fairly helpful in the G20? The Russians, who after 9/11 actually facilitated US bases in Central Asia for supply chain and logistics. That wouldn't be happening. So that's, when I look at what's happening in Europe and more broadly at populism, I'm less worried that we're about to have an implosion, an Arab Spring moment in a major developed economy, not at all. I'm more worried that we haven't experienced any major crisis since this started. And when we do have one, whatever it is, I don't think we're going to like the way we respond to it.
That sounds kind of scary.
It's a little scarier, yeah.
A little scary, but, and of course, Neil, you know this a little bit more firsthand, given your ties to the old country. You're worried? Are you worried about Britain?
Yes. I think Brexit did seem to start the populist ball rolling. I was, full disclosure, on the Remain side, and not out of any love for the European Union. I'd been seen as a Eurosceptic for many years, had been very opposed to the creation of a single currency. But my feeling was that Brexit would be a much, much harder and more costly divorce than anybody on the Brexit side wanted to admit. I was right, because what has happened over the last 3 years has been an absolutely appalling failure of political leadership that has come close to destroying the Conservative Party. And if you think that Boris Johnson can save the day, then I have a bridge to sell you. Because Boris's record of bungling jobs and nevertheless getting promoted does not inspire any confidence in me whatsoever. In any case, he will be in exactly the same situation that Theresa May was in throughout her period as Prime Minister. There is no alternative Brexit available. The Europeans are not going to renegotiate. So what is Britain going to do? Pretend that it's willing to do a no-deal crash out no-deal Brexit at the end of October. I think it's an implausible threat because I don't think Britain is capable of withstanding the upheaval that would be involved. And so the only real question in my mind is how long can this weak, unpopular Conservative government survive before there has to be either another referendum or a general election. And when that election happens, I very much fear, because the Conservatives have so mucked this up, and because they are now so divided that an enormous number of their voters are voting for Nigel Farage's Brexit Party, at a general election, they will lose about 200 seats. And at that point, Jeremy Corbyn is the Prime Minister of Britain, no matter how inept and unpleasant he is. He's the leader of the Labour Party, and in those situations where the Conservative vote is essentially split, the Labour Party will form the next government, probably in coalition with the Scottish Nationalists and the Liberal Democrats. And I hate to think what that government will do. It will certainly not be a loyal partner in the transatlantic alliance with the United States, because Jeremy Corbyn is a profoundly anti-American figure who has for long been more or less a fellow traveller in Cold War terms, who was on the wrong side of practically every political issue in my lifetime. So I am filled with despair, and I fear that when all is said and done, Brexit will have been one of the epic fails of the populist era. That's a sad thing to have to say. After the referendum result, I said towards the end of 2016, I get it, I understand why English and Welsh voters went for it. By the way, Scottish voters didn't. I understand why they went for it. I can see why they were disillusioned with Europe. In some ways, Europe had it coming because Europe had bungled the financial crisis, bungled the Arab Spring, and then bungled the migration crisis. In some ways, you could understand why people felt the way they did in 2016. But what has failed them, what has failed ordinary British Eurosceptics, is the blundering political elite that essentially was entrusted with the task of executing Brexit. And it's a sorry, sorry mess.
Are you supportive of a second referendum?
No, not really, because I think there's no good outcome in a second referendum. Either you get the same result, in which case what have you achieved, or you end up with the opposite result, which will alienate for the rest of their lives the people who voted to leave. So I'm against another referendum. I don't think it would really change anything in a good way. But I fear there's almost no conceivable way that the Conservatives can survive in a general election, even although Boris is clearly a more engaging and attractive figure than Theresa May, and that must be good for some votes. I just don't see how you recover from the mess they've made.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I said we'd do global hotspots, and I do also want to ask a closing question. But it does occur to me that maybe for the first time since I've done one of these things, the Mideast was not at the top of my list as a priority. And I wonder if you could just maybe talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, first of all, under the Obama administration, there was an attempt to pivot to Asia. It did not succeed, but the strategy was correct, which is the United States should be focused much more where the future of the global economy, global security, global technology is going to be. The Middle East has none of those things. And, you know, now we're the world's largest energy producer. Everybody here knows that.
Freedom molecules.
Yes.
Did you hear about that?
Freedom molecules, absolutely.
We're rebranding our energy exports to be freedom molecules.
Yeah.
I think it's brilliant.
Well, they do. They move around a lot. So, I mean, you know, I think there's that. So, I mean, should we be paying as much attention to the Middle East? No. It's kind of ironic in the sense that Trump's best personal relationships in the world are with MBS, MBZ, Netanyahu. So they're all three are the Middle East, you know, sort of leaders that are in many ways traditional allies of the United States. But how much are they really doing for us? How much do we really care? Trump personally wants to get out of a lot of these conflicts. He's happy to engage in a quick bomb in Syria when they use chemical weapons, but he doesn't really want him. He's pushing back against McMaster, Mattis, others trying to keep lots of troops in the region. I mean, God bless Jared, he wants to do a deal with the Israelis and the Gulfies and cut the Palestinians out. And the reason that's even plausible to talk about is because if you're not Palestinian and you're in the Middle East, you don't prioritize Israel-Palestine anymore. You know, your view is, no, we've got to deal with Syria and Yemen and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all these other issues. And Israel-Palestine, who cares? You know, we can, Oman, the Sultan of Oman just actually met with Netanyahu Directly. I mean, 5 years ago, not even conceivable. So, I mean, I do think that the Middle East, it's more of a mess. It's being affected more by extreme climate conditions. I mean, long term, you can't imagine that just taking energy out of the ground is going to really work. The whole MBS issues in Saudi Arabia means that they're not going, because he's constrained, he won't be able to transform the economy to make human capital really work the way he had wanted to. So what are the economies in the Middle East that you're going to bet on in the long term? And the answer is not much, right? You'd bet on Israel. You'd bet a little like on Egypt and a little on Jordan, but you wouldn't really bet on these countries. So, I mean, I think it is correct for us to not be spending much time right now in the Middle East.
Well, I'm going to give it a more positive spin than that, because it seems to me that after the epic fail of the Obama policy in the Middle East, they actually made a colossal strategic error with respect to Syria, which President Obama later claimed was his best decision, but the result was a catastrophe. The country was plunged into an ongoing war with enormous casualties. The Russians were able to insert themselves back into the Middle East for the first time since the early 1970s. And actually, the Trump administration has done much, much better. And the way it's done better has been by abandoning the idea that we could get anywhere with Iran, pulling out of what was, I think, ultimately a bad deal, and refocusing on our traditional alliances with Israel and with Saudi Arabia, and doing something which no administration has ever achieved before, which is to build a broad front extending from Saudi Arabia all the way through the Arab world to Israel against Iran. And that has radically altered the geopolitical stakes in Israel's favor. When you think back to the time when Israel was almost completely isolated in the region. I think one of the great advantages that Jared has with his peace plan is that expectations are so low that you and other commentators essentially think it's dead before arrival. Yeah. That's a very good place to start with what seems to me like a not bad idea, essentially to use Gulf money to buy the Palestinians off. To address the problem economically, and then to have all the nitty-gritty territorial discussions after you've already given Israel 2 big wins. Now, I'm not saying it's gonna work, but I think it's got a better than 0% probability, and it is a reflection of a fundamental realignment in the region. You're rolling your eyes in a rather New Yorky way that we don't.
For a Scot to say that in Texas
but
is
hang
so
on.
wrong.
This is actually a major improvement on the situation that we had at the end of the Obama presidency.
That wasn't my rolling my eyes about that. I was rolling my eyes at better than 0% that Jared gets a deal done. The reason I support Jared focusing on this is because he's not focusing on other things. And I think that's good. No, because when Kerry spent a year and a half, this was the Secretary of State of the United States, the most important, powerful foreign policy official in the United States, and he literally spent a year and a half on Israel-Palestine as opposed to other things. That's a fireable offense in my view. Doing it with your son-in-law who shouldn't have an official position and can't get a clearance, I'm fine with that. And I think the likelihood that he fixes Israel-Palestine is exactly 0.
These are cheap shots, but I think
yes, they are.
They are cheap shots. We're not on Saturday Night Live. The key issue that you're not acknowledging is that there has been a fundamental geopolitical shift to the great disadvantage of Iran, to the advantage of Israel. The only real problem is Israel's domestic politics. That's almost always the problem. I think if Netanyahu had actually been able to form a government, then the prospects would actually be quite bright, because Israel has now been given enough concessions by the Trump administration to be in a position, from a position of strength, to make some concessions to the Palestinian side. So I don't write this off, and I think it's actually rather conventional wisdom on your part to say there's a 0% probability of success.
I think you'll
be very.
Nothing is zero, but I take your point on Iran, and I think absolutely we have somewhat disagreements over how bad the Iranian deal is. I believe that Pompeo's approach, which is stay in the deal but use the Europeans to push the Iranians to do more because we're credible around it, and put other sanctions on but don't pull out, I would have preferred that. Not the point. I think that what's interesting, I do believe that the Americans under Trump are actually getting farther with Iran than most of Trump opponents would have expected at this point, even to the point that there's a decent chance that the Iranians and the Americans might actually meet with no preconditions, as Trump said, and Shinzo Abe is heading out there this week, right? And he's doing some bidding for Trump. None of that is bad. But if you ask me, do I believe that President Trump should be spending significant time trying to really build up a better alliance with the Saudis, and that is going to be of strategic interest to the Americans compared to other allies around the world? I would say no.
All right, I'm going to stop you both there. So I had 3 different possible ending questions, but now I've changed my mind completely. And so we only have a few minutes left. We're here on the campus of Southern Methodist University. Both of you teach, both of you write, you deal with a lot of young people, and it's been graduation time. There's a lot of people here who either have children or grandchildren, nieces, nephews that have graduated and they're embarking on their careers and they're going to college. What would you advise if they're interested in these issues that they focus on or that they think about majoring in? Or your general advice is, you see students today, what could set young people apart competitively in the next few years?
The most important thing is that they must study history. The decline of serious study of history is one of the really concerning features of academic life and, it must be said, public life today. And one cannot understand the issues that we're discussing without some historical perspective. But they must also understand the dramatic changes that technology has brought about and will continue to bring about in their lifetime. So the well-educated young person trying to navigate this extraordinarily complex world needs both an understanding of history to get some perspective and an insight into the ways in which, for example, artificial intelligence will alter almost every aspect of life in the coming decades.
Ian?
Critical thinking, dipping into lots of different fields so that you have the level of intellectual curiosity to respond well over your lifetime, given how quickly things are changing, how quickly the skill sets you need are changing. But I mean, also, when I talk to young students that are thinking about coming to my firm, for example, I almost always ask them, who's someone, give me some people that you really respect intellectually, that you follow their work, and you profoundly disagree with them. Very few can answer that question. And
I would just say Ian Bremmer. And wouldn't that get you the job?
Yeah. I mean, if you were applying, it would absolutely get you the job. There's no question. No, I mean, I think it's funny. No one has actually answered that, and now, of course, they all will.
Yeah.
But
the obvious.
But they don't. But they don't answer. They don't know. The answer is they don't do it. They don't do it enough, and that is such a problem. And I also tell them it's not that you have to watch more CNN if you watch Fox or more Fox if you watch CNN. I know. I'm sorry, but I know. But I know, but just the affiliation. It wasn't making it personal. But I try to get people. I say, you know what? Watch the English language Japanese news about the world. Watch NHK for an hour, once a week, young people, because getting that perspective. I mean, it's a little bit boring, right? It's not a lot of graphics, and it's pretty safe. But
they don't have a breaking news alert?
They don't have breaking news alert. There's not a whole bunch of screens and scrolling and all that. But my God, like, it's so important to get those perspectives. And I just see that I mean, I obviously completely agree with Neil that we're losing history and background and context. But I think people are getting so narrow. And all the social media is making it so much harder to break out of that, and this is a way you need to do it.
That's great advice. Niall Ferguson and Ian Bremmer, thank you so much. Look at that. We ended at 1 second.
Right, yeah.
Thanks to all 3 of you for a phenomenal conversation. In fact, on Ian's Twitter, at the very top, the permanent entry is, "You're not using Twitter right if you're not following somebody you disagree with." And I want to thank this discussion, because highlighting Cold War II, highlighting questions about what happens in a crisis in the New World Order, and looking out for Jeremy Corbyn are all very important things that we need to have our antenna up for. So thank you for that. I also want to say that for people here who haven't already done it, make sure you download the Strategist podcasts of the Bush Institute, because we recorded earlier today an episode, one with Dana and one with Ian, that'll be up shortly. So thank you for them for doing that, and you'll all get to hear more. And thank you again to Highland Capital Management for making this series possible. Don't forget forget their books are on sale, and don't forget to be on the lookout for the September 18th Engage event with Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch, and November 4th, the Laura Bush Book Club event with Alexander McCall Smith. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at a future event.